In this video, I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about using the Sony A7R IV for wildlife photography. Hey guys, for those of you who are already subscribers to my channel, and if you're not a subscriber, why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. You'll know that it's been a little while since I posted a video. I was in Africa for the whole month of October, and when I was there early on in my trip in Zambia and Botswana, I did manage to get a couple of videos out, but then when I moved to South Africa, I was in the field quite a lot, and so I didn't manage to post anything then, but I am very excited about making this video for you now. The reason I didn't make this video and post it earlier is because I really wanted to get a lot of time in with the A7R IV before I shared my thoughts with you. So I've been using the A7R IV for 1.5 months now since the camera was first released, and I actually have two of the cameras. I initially bought one and thought that I might use it alongside my A7R III. And the experience was so good. Now the camera is not perfect, and there's many things I'll talk about later on, but the experience was so good that I decided just to get a second one. And so out in the field I've been using two A7R IVs plus an A9. I calculated that since I got the cameras and started using them, and I've been out in the field pretty much every day, I calculated that I've spent at least 500 hours in the field with the cameras, and that I've shot over 50,000 images. So I feel like I've got some decent experience with it now. And I also should mention that I feel that I've shot in a wide range of conditions with the cameras. I was in when I first got the cameras in mid-September, I was in British Columbia photographing grizzly bears. It was raining a fair bit, also even snowed on the last day. When I was in Africa for the whole month of October, it was generally very hot and dry sometimes, but it was also the start of the wet season, and so there were some heavy rains at times as well. In terms of light conditions, I shot a lot in low light, as I often do very early in the morning and late in the day. I even did in Africa a bunch of night photography with wildlife and using some subtle lighting. In terms of subjects, I photographed a lot of different things since I've had the cameras. As I mentioned, grizzly bears. When I was in Africa, I also photographed all kinds of species, from very small to very large animals, a lot of mammals, a lot of birds, birds in flight, birds fishing, and so forth. So, in this video, I'm going to talk about 4 things, and this video is just about using the A7R IV for wildlife photography. So I'm going to talk about, firstly, what I think is great about the camera for wildlife photography. The second thing is what I think is not so great about the camera for wildlife photography. The third thing is that I'm going to compare the A7R IV to the A7R III and the A9 and the A9II for wildlife photography. And then finally, I'm going to run through some tips and tricks for using the camera for wildlife photography. So let's get started. The first thing that's so great about the A7R IV for wildlife photography is the increased resolution. And this is probably the feature that was most talked about when the camera was announced, and probably also since the camera has been released. There were some people who had said when the camera was first announced, who needs this much resolution? Well, it's definitely an asset for wildlife photography, not just for getting incredible detail and being able to print at a very large size, but for being able to crop in. It means that you, as I mentioned in some previous videos I made, that you don't necessarily need to have a really long lens and always be getting in so tight on the shots, but you can take more of an environmental shot, and then you can crop in later on, and you can even possibly change the aspect ratio. It gives you a lot of flexibility. I want to show you a few examples of how I've been able to use the resolution of this camera. So let me show you how much incredible detail you can capture using the A7R IV with the right lens. This is a set of images that were taken recently, well, not all of them, but some of them, the ones I'm going to show you, were taken in Africa in the last month, and they were using the Sony 135mm G Master lens. Let's start with this image of a lion. If we look in Lightroom on the right hand side there, you'll see the image is 3523 by 3523. So this is 20% of the original image in terms of the crop. We'll take a look here now, and you can see that's the crop and that's the original image. You can see just how much I've cropped in. I've cropped into 20% of the original image. Again, let's look at the crop and the original image. And now if we look at the cropped image, we can zoom in further and just see how much incredible detail there is. Look at the fur on the mane there. Look at the fur on the face. Look at the eye. Quite impressive, I think. And this is an image that was not really taken in exactly optimal lighting conditions. It was quite bright, very harsh light outside. Fortunately, the lion itself was under some shade. Now let's look at an image of a cheetah. So I was very fortunate to be able to lie down next to this cheetah about 5 meters away from her, and again using the 135mm lens. If we look at the size of the image, it's 2452 by 2452, so I've cropped it square like I did with the lion. This is about 10% of the original image. So let's look at the crop, and now let's look at the original image. You can see it's a huge crop in. There's the crop again, and there's the original image. And yet, even when the image has been cropped that much, if we zoom right in and we look at the detail on the eye, on the fur, on the face, on the nose, the whiskers, incredible detail. And let's look at one more example. So here is an image of a nyala, which is an antelope. This was not cropped, so the image is 6336 by 9504. That's the full resolution of the camera. But let's zoom in and look at the face. Just wait for Lightroom to catch up. Look at the detail on the face, quite incredible. And let's go crazy here. Let's look at the eyeball. There is detail that is showing up in the eyeball that is reflection in the eyeball. And if we zoom out, we see just how little of the total image that eyeball is, but yet there's detail that you can see in the eyeball. Quite incredible. One thing that's great about this high resolution sensor is that it really gives you the opportunity to, in some cases, extract more out of your lenses. So what I mean by that is that since getting the A7R IV, I've been able to see how much sharper the Sony 135 GM lens is than the 400 GM G Master. And that's something I had seen that before with the A7R III, but I see it a lot more now with the A7R IV. So there's actually two aspects to this. One is that you need to have a lens that is really going to do the sensor justice, where the lens is able to resolve detail so that you can really take advantage of the sensor. But on the other hand, when you have this sensor, and you have a lens like the 135 G Master, it's actually also showing off what that lens can do. The second thing that's great about this camera is the ergonomics. The camera is so much nicer to hold now. The grip is deeper, the buttons are bigger, and it's just a real pleasure to use. And I think especially also for people who are coming from larger bodies, from DSLR bodies, and have found a lot of the mirrorless cameras and the Sony cameras to be a little too small in the hand, I think they will find that the A7R IV is a much easier transition to make. The other thing is that the shutter is so much softer and quieter now, and this is really helpful when you're photographing wildlife, especially if you're photographing wildlife up close. And I've been doing a lot of that, even from hides or blinds sometimes, where the animals know that I'm there, but they can't see me, and that allows them to come up closer and be relaxed. And when the shutter is quieter, that also helps with that as well. The other thing that I've really noticed, especially because my eyes are not so good, is the electronic viewfinder. The high resolution is really nice. I can't see the display on the back of my camera unless I put it really far away. So generally I don't use the display, I use the viewfinder for everything, and I have the diopter set for my eyes. So I'm looking through the viewfinder all the time, and I really noticed how much better the viewfinder is now with the A7R IV. The other thing is that going back to the resolution with this camera, and this was talked about a lot, and I mentioned it in some previous videos, is that now the crop mode on this camera is so much more useful. So I'm talking about the APS-C mode, where you are using less of the sensor. And previously with the A7R III, when you went into crop mode or APS-C mode, the image was only 18 megapixels, but now with this camera it's now 26 megapixels, which is actually more than the APS-C bodies that Sony has, which are 24 megapixels. So crop mode is so much more useful now, and that is great because you can often use it in place of a teleconverter. So for example, most of the time that I've been using this camera, I've not been reaching for my teleconverter when I would have done that in the past. It's just so much more convenient to basically flip into crop mode, or of course you can also crop in later on in post, but when you do it in the camera, you can immediately see what it's going to look like. It also gives you a much more detailed view, a more magnified view to see what you're doing. And especially if you are shooting prime lenses, which I'm doing, you're effectively doubling the number of focal lengths that you have available. So when I have my 400 on there, when I use the crop mode, I've now got a 600 effectively. When I'm using the 135 and I use the crop mode, I effectively now have a 200 millimeter lens. And the thing that's great, of course, is that unlike the teleconverter, when you use that and you lose a stop of light, you're not losing a stop of light in terms of gathering light when you go into crop mode. So I find it fantastic, and I've been using crop mode a fair bit. However, there is an issue with this that I'll discuss later on. The other thing is that the tracking autofocus is better with the A7R IV than the A7R III. Now, everyone asks, is it as good as the A9? And I'll discuss that later on. The final thing that I want to mention, and this is really not a wildlife photography thing, but I just want to mention it because I love it. And if you use the A7R IV for doing any video work with people, whether it's for videoing other people or doing vlogging like I'm doing right now, the video eye AF, the ability to detect and lock in focus on the eyes, is a fantastic thing. So I'm using the A7R IV right now to record this video, and the video eye autofocus is just a wonderful thing. It means you can use a very shallow depth of field and always know that it's going to lock in on the eyes. Now let me tell you about some of the things with the A7R IV that I think are not so great when you're using it for wildlife photography. The first thing is clearing the buffer. When you shoot in burst mode and you load up the buffer with images, the time that it takes to clear that buffer is too slow. And more specifically, even though I haven't timed it against the A7R III, it feels a lot slower. I felt that immediately when I got the camera and started using it, and ever since then I've also felt that it's much slower. And now, of course, I have my A9 that I compare it to, which, of course, to be fair, right, we're talking about images that are way bigger in size. We're talking about 60 megapixel images versus 24 megapixel images in the A9. But when I go to the A9, of course, the buffer is bigger and it clears those images so much faster. So to be clear, this is the price that you pay for using, for having the ability to shoot at such a high resolution. But when you load up images in the buffer and when you're waiting for it to clear, it really feels like it's just taking a while. And I found that if you switch to using compressed RAW format, that improves things only slightly, and it only seems to improve it with the first few images that it clears out of the buffer. Thereafter, it still seems to be just as slow. It doesn't really seem to make that much difference whether you're shooting in compressed RAW or uncompressed RAW in terms of clearing the buffer. The second thing, which is related to clearing the buffer, is that there has always been a limitation with Sony's cameras. It exists with the A7R IV and with the A9 and the A7R III, and that is that when there are any images at all in the buffer, even just one or two, you are unable to switch back and forth between crop and full frame modes. So what this means is that you can get into a situation where the buffer is not full. You're able to keep taking shots because there is some space in the buffer, but you want to switch into or out of crop mode and you can't do it. And the worst possible case of this, I think, is, and I've run into this a couple of times, is that let's say you're in crop mode and you've taken a whole bunch of shots and it's clearing the buffer, and now all of a sudden, and let's say the animal is coming closer to you, now you want to switch out of crop mode and back into full frame mode, but it's still clearing the buffer. There's still some images in there. Even though the buffer is not full, you can't switch out of crop mode. You're stuck in crop mode, and this is quite frustrating. You have no choice except to just keep shooting in the same mode as the shots that were in the buffer. You have to wait until the buffer is completely cleared, and I really don't understand why this limitation exists. It can be frustrating at times, and what it means is you've really got to think and plan ahead and make sure that you don't fill up the buffer, make sure that the buffer is completely empty when you're ready, when you know that you're going to need to switch out. Now, to be clear, the ability to use crop mode, as I mentioned, as one of the things that's great about this camera, the ability to use it even more now because it has such a high resolution in crop mode. It's still way more convenient than putting on a teleconverter, right? So in that way, it's still actually better, but it could be so much better if this limitation didn't exist. So I really hope that this is something that is not a hardware limitation, but is something that they could fix in software and fix in a firmware upgrade. That's what I really hope. The third thing, which is not a surprise, again, it's one of the prices that you pay for this high resolution sensor, is that the file sizes are huge. And if you're shooting, for example, in uncompressed RAW, the files previously on the A7R III were about 80 megabytes in size. They would now be about 120 megabytes in size. So you may want to think about moving to compressed RAW. There is a slight decrease in quality, but that's what I've done. In fact, now the images are 60 megabytes in size, so they're in fact actually smaller than the 80 megabyte images that I had with the A7R III. The other thing, and again, this is another price to pay, shouldn't be a surprise, it's another price to pay for using this high resolution sensor, is that the quality of the images, the performance at higher ISOs is worse than the A7R III. That shouldn't be a surprise because there's more pixels, the pixel density is higher on the sensor, which means the photo sites are smaller and they're each collecting less light. And what has been found with this camera through testing is that there are two ISOs at which you're going to get the maximum dynamic range, and one is ISO 100 and the other one is ISO 320. Now with the A7R III and the A9, it's different. It's ISO 100 and ISO 640. So really, what Sony have done with this camera is they've optimized the dual gain structure so that you get better quality at lower ISOs, and then thereafter, when you move up higher, say ISO 640 and above, you're going to find that the camera performs worse than the A7R3. So I generally try with this camera to avoid going over ISO 1600 or 2000, and more typically I'm actually shooting at way lower than that, 100 or 320. Now let's talk about the A7R4 versus some of Sony's other full-frame cameras. So first of all, let's talk about the A7R3. To be clear, the A7R3 is still a fantastic camera for wildlife photography. There's two things that I think we need to keep in mind here. One is, as I mentioned, the A7R4's higher ISO performance is worse than the A7R3. So if you're shooting at higher ISOs, you're probably going to be disappointed with the A7R4. And one reason that you might be doing that is because you might be shooting with zooms, where you are forced to shoot at smaller apertures when you're extended out further in terms of focal length when you're zoomed in. And also, I think there's a question as to whether or not some of those lenses, the zoom lenses like the 100 to 400 and the 200 to 600, whether those lenses are capable of resolving detail to the level at which they can take advantage of this sensor. A lot of people have been buying the 200 to 600 and using it with the A7R4 and not seeing the results that they expect. And one of the things to be clear too about the A7R4 and this increased resolution is that you're going to get incredible levels of detail in your images, which also means that if there are issues in the image, if there are aberrations with the lenses, you're going to see those in more detail too. So the thing is that it's not clear to me that those lenses, the 100 to 400 and the 200 to 600, really are able to resolve detail at the level that would allow you to take advantage of the A7R4. So if you're shooting zooms, my thinking is that you're probably better off with the A7R3, and that the A7R4 is you're not necessarily going to extract the most out of that camera, and in some cases it actually may you may end up producing images that are actually worse because they're actually showing more detail, in more detail, some of the issues that you might have, or some of the limitations of those lenses. And let's be clear, when you look at the prices of the zoom lenses, they are so much less expensive, right? Like the 200 to 600 is $2,000 US. The 100 to 400 is $2,500 US. At the other end of the scale, you've got the prime lenses. The 400 prime is $12,000 US. The 600 prime is $13,000 US. And the 200 to 600 is, in terms of function, is a fantastic lens, right? It has the ability to zoom in and out, so you've got more compositional and framing flexibility than either of the prime lenses, and it has more reach than the 400 prime and the 100 to 400 zoom. But yet that lens is the cheapest lens of all four of those telephoto lenses. So, and I realize that there are different economies of scale that might apply here, that they might have different margins that they're working with on these products, but I think for all that function that you get, there has to be something that you're going to give up, and whether that's detail and the inability to resolve detail at the level that you want it to for a camera like the A7R4, or whether it's focusing speed and the ability to, or inability to keep up with a camera like the A9, I'm not sure. But my thought is anyway that I think if you're shooting with zooms, that you might actually be better off with the A7R3. Let's talk about the A9 and also the A9 II. Now, and to be clear, I don't have my hands on an A9II at this stage. Now, previously, before the A7R4 and the A9II were released, the comparison would have been between the A7R3 and the A9. And I've made some videos in the past talking about this and talking about why I think, in some cases, the A7R3 was actually a better choice than the A9. But now, of course, we wouldn't compare, if we're talking about flagship cameras, we wouldn't compare the A7R3 and the A9, we would compare the A7R4 and the A9II. And in some ways, that decision is actually easier now for two reasons, because obviously there's now a big resolution gap, or a bigger resolution gap. It used to be comparing 42 megapixels to 24 megapixels. Now we're comparing 61 megapixels to 24 megapixels. The other thing is that the higher ISO performance of the A7R4 has gone down from the A7R3, and apparently the A9II's higher ISO performance has gone up from the A9. So that gap has also increased. So the resolution gap has increased, and the higher ISO performance the gap has increased too. So that in some ways makes the decision easier. Now, lots of people ask me all the time about the tracking autofocus in the A7R4. Is it better than the A7R3? The answer is yes, it's better. Is it as good as the A9? It's not as good as the A9, but I believe it's pretty close. However, let me just say that I generally don't think the tracking is the issue. The A7R4's tracking is good enough for most cases. And to be clear too, the A9's tracking is fantastic, but it's not perfect. And some of the problems that it has in losing tracking, especially when you're talking about wildlife subjects, when you have something like a bird and the bird's head is moving around and bobbing up and down erratically, the A9 and any of the other cameras will often lose the lock on the object. But sometimes it'll actually lose it completely, or it will actually drift. So if you put the lock on the focus area on the bird's head, and the head pops down and then pops back up again, often the focus area will have moved down from the head to the neck, and then as the head moves around, the focus area will continue to move, and the camera acts as if it is still locked on the head, but it actually isn't. It's moving relative to the head, but it's not locked on the head anymore. And so that problem exists with the A9, just as it does with the other cameras too. So to be clear, the tracking of the A9 is not perfect. The A7R4's tracking is, I believe, it's good enough. So I don't believe the tracking is the issue. I believe it's really, and this is why, even as good as the A7R4 is, this is why I will always have an A9 in my arsenal, even though I would only use it a small percentage of the time for what I do. And that is that it's not the tracking that's the issue, but it's really the frame rate that I think is more of the issue. The thing is that 10 frames per second that you can get out of the A7R4, it's sometimes not enough to get that critical frame, that frame that is like the money shot. You may miss that if you don't have 20 frames a second and the action is happening very fast. The other thing is if you talk about sustained action. So what I mean by that is that you are bursting, and you're bursting a lot all the time. As I mentioned with the A7R4 now, it's easier to fill up the buffer and end up in a situation where you can't shoot or you can't switch in and out of crop mode because there are images in the buffer. And you're going to find that with the A7R4 that is much more likely to happen now than the A7R3, and therefore it's in comparison to the A9, it's going to happen a lot more. So whenever there is sustained action, or when the action is very fast, I switch to my A9, even though I know I'm losing resolution. That's the price that I pay to get those critical frames, ensure that I don't miss out on something. So in summary, I think the A9, it's going to be better than the A7R4 obviously for higher ISOs, and also if you're shooting fast action or sustained action. And finally, I want to give you a few tips and tricks for using the A7R for wildlife photography. There are a bunch of things that I already mentioned, and I'll just repeat some of them. Firstly, I think it is important to know about the limitations of this camera. You get this fantastic resolution now with this new sensor, but there is a price to pay for it. So with the higher ISO performance, with the buffer, these are all things to think about. And so if you have, for example, an A9 in your kit, you want to think about when you're going to switch to the A9 instead of using the A7R4. In my case, I shoot with the A7R4 90% of the time, if not higher. But there are definitely times that even though I don't use the A9 much, that I will definitely reach for it, because I know if I don't use that camera, I may actually miss out on things when I'm using the A7R4. The other thing that I talked about earlier is the lens situation. I really think, even though I haven't tested it, but I really think that primes will be best suited for using the A7R4. You're going to extract the most out of it. If you are shooting zooms now, and perhaps if you've thought about switching to primes, this is a good impetus to do it, because I think that there's just a really good match there, especially between Sony's primes. And I'm using the 24G Master, the 135G Master, and the 400G Master. I have other lenses that I use, but those are the ones that I often take into the field with me, and they're a fantastic fit, as I would expect for a camera like this, right? They've been designed with the future in mind, and even with higher resolution sensors in mind than even the 61 megapixel sensor in the A7R4. So I know that they're a good match. I also know that all three of those lenses perform very well when they're shot wide open, and which is something that I do a lot. So the lenses is another thing to think about. Now, I also mentioned the crop mode. I talked about that a lot, and specifically the inability to switch in and out of crop mode, as well as the fact that the crop mode is so much more usable now. So I really do think that if you have a teleconverter, that if you're using the A7R4, that you may find you really don't need to use it as much. And for that, it's fantastic. But if there's a lot of action happening, if you're having to do a lot of bursting, you really need to be careful about how you burst, and especially if you're going to switch in and out of crop mode, you don't want to end up in a situation where you can't do it because of this limitation right now, when there are images in the buffer that you're unable to make that switch. So you want to be judicious and plan ahead where you can, and that example that I gave before, where something is coming towards you and perhaps you've gone into crop mode to zoom in and get some shots, and then as it's coming towards you, you want to get out of crop mode and back into full frame mode. You need to be careful about how you're bursting so that you don't end up in a situation when you can't do that. One of the things that I think is very helpful is there is an option in the menu called Cont Shoot Length, continuous shooting length, and you can set that to always display, and it will show a little bar on the side of the display that shows you how much is in the buffer. And I find that fairly helpful, so that I can it'll help me judge how much that I have available to shoot. The other thing I want to talk about is just about focus modes. This is not really an A7R4 specific thing, but often people ask me what focus modes that I'm using. One of the things I want to be clear about also is, animal eye autofocus is a fantastic thing for wildlife photography, but it's not foolproof. And to be clear, this is Sony's first implementation of it, and it's actually, I would say, it performs way better than we might have thought it would, based on what they said. I think the initial thinking was it's going to work well with cats and dogs. Well, it actually turns out that it works well with many other species, but it doesn't always work with every species, and it doesn't always work with every species in every situation. So even animals that I found that it works well with, there are lots of cases where it won't find the eye, and it will also make mistakes where it actually will lock onto something else that is not the eye and think that it's the eye. Also, I talked before, and I gave the example about the bird's head, about the tracking autofocus, and that also is fantastic, but it's not foolproof, right? So the thing is that those things are great aids, but I think you also need to be prepared to fall back to the old ways of doing things. And if you're, for example, trying to maintain focus on eyes or on head, moving the focus area around, I think is still something that I do a lot, especially also because I shoot with shallow depth of field a lot. It's something that I do as a creative choice, even though sometimes I know that I have the ability to stop down. I decide that I don't want to do it. That means, though, that the focus, getting the focus in the right place is even more important for me. So I can't always rely on these things like tracking, animal eye autofocus, or just a general tracking to work. And so I use them, but I don't rely on them all the time. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and that you found it helpful and informative. If you have any questions or comments, please post down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.